Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming again. I'm Sally Wren, Chair of the Diversity Awareness Committee here, and I just love having all of you come out and join us. And we start by giving gratitude and thanks for all of those who've gone before us and cleared our path, but especially the Duwamish tribe, on whose land we stand. Tonight, Joan Singler has brought us a wonderful program, and Joan had to have a little surgery yesterday, and just think how all of you would feel if you'd been told you can't talk for 8 days. So we just send her lots of healing love and appreciation for this wonderful program. And with that, I would like to introduce to you Lupe Gamboa. And Lupe is one of 9 siblings that grew up working at the beet fields in Sunnyside, Washington, while attending elementary school to supplement the family income. This was a time there was no basic labor protection for farm workers. Wages were very low. There were no bathroom facilities or water supplied in the fields, nor any safety regulations enjoyed by the other workers. This unfair work environment for him, his family, and all farm workers motivated Lupe to become a farm worker rights advocate. He was the first farm worker to be accepted and graduated from the University of Washington Law School. Tonight, he will share with you his journey and struggle to secure higher wages and better working conditions for thousands of farm workers. Lupe has lectured at the U of W's American Ethics Study Department, where he taught the history of the farm worker labor and civil rights movement to the next generation of leaders. He was appointed to the Human Rights Commission by Governor Inslee in 2015 for his work in protecting the rights of farm workers. And the Legal Foundation of Washington in 1994 awarded Lupe the highest award given to public interest lawyers, the Golden Distinguished Service Award. More recently, Lupe is a part of the World Rights Program officer for the Oxfam America, and that stands for Oxford Committee for Famine Relief, which was started in Britain in 1942 to prevent famine on the Grecian islands. And in that role, he co-founded the Equal Food Initiative, a nonprofit certification and skill-building organization that brings together growers, retailers, and consumers to improve the lives of farm workers. And it is a great privilege and pleasure to introduce to you Lupe.
Hasta México ha llegado la noticia muy alegre que de verlo es diferente. Pues el pueblo ya está en contra de los rancheros y engreídos que acababan con la gente. Y como somos hermanos, la alegría compartimos con todos los campesinos. ¡Viva la revolución! ¡Viva nuestra asociación! ¡Viva huelga en general! El 18 de septiembre de los campos de Deleno salieron los filipinos. Y después de 2 semanas para unirse a la batalla salieron los mexicanos. Y juntos vamos cumpliendo con la marcha de la historia para liberar el pueblo. ¡Viva la revolución! ¡Viva nuestra asociación! ¡Viva huelga en general! ¡Viva la huelga en el fin! viva la causa y la historia, la raza llena de gloria, la victoria va a cumplir. Póngale la Biblia, sí, pero se toca en California, ¿verdad? Nos dicen los patroncitos que el trabajo siempre se hace con bastantes resquirones. Y de nuevo a León, a Texas, han traído sinvergüenzas muertos de hambre por frijoles. Pero hombres de la raza se fajan.
Thanks for the introduction, Sally, and thanks for inviting me to speak here. The song you heard was Viva, Viva Huelga en General, long live the general strike, and just to give you a flavor of the organizing, kind of the art and kind of environment created by the Farm Workers Union when they started to organize in California. So the title of my talk is Fight in the Fields, how the struggle for farm worker justice, for social and economic justice, not only improve the wages for farm workers and living conditions, but help create a more just society in Washington State. People ask me, how did you become involved in the farm workers movement? And my answer is, well, I was born into it. I was a child of eighth child of a family of 9 of farm workers, and so I was born into poverty and suffered all the conditions, bad conditions. So I had kind of lived experience of what it meant to be a farm worker. And this slide here is actually it's a slide of my father, who's Lupe Gamboa, who's standing there, and this is a truck that we used to migrate when we were migrant farm workers, and I'm looking out the back of the truck, because the truck only had like space for 2 or 3 in the front, so the rest of that 9 family had to travel in the back, and we would come from the Rio Grande Valley in Texas to here, which is a long, long ways over very small roads at that time. And I can't. My sister is also peeking out, Francis, and this is my dog Tuffy. So we, very, very dear member of the family. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the conditions of migrant farm worker life. Let me see. This is a picture of a young worker. He's about 8 or 9 years old, but already he's working, cutting asparagus in the Yakima Valley. And if you notice, he's got a big can that's almost half as big as he is, full of asparagus, which is very heavy. But everybody had to work because wages were so low, and work was seasonal. So, and plus, if you had no protection, no unemployment insurance or industrial insurance, the whole family had to pull together out of necessity. And in addition to that, we had to live in labor camps. Most of them all run down, usually with bunk beds, and some had straw for mattresses. And we had very dangerous working conditions. I remember once I was working and a crop duster flew overhead and sprayed us all with pesticides. Another one of the terrible working conditions is that there was unrestrained wage theft. This is a copy of a check from a big asparagus company in Walla Walla called Rogers and Walla Walla, and if you can see it's kind of fake, but the total wages. This is for a week of work, and the total wages is at the bottom. Can you see it there? It's very. Yeah. after the deductions, this worker worked a whole week for just that piddly amount of money. 29 cents. And it might be shocking, but this wasn't that uncommon. And this happened because farm workers as a class were excluded from all the legislation, labor legislation and federal legislation. And I'll get into the the reasons why. The simple explanation is because of institutional racism. At that time in the 30s, mid 30s, you had two parties. You had the Republicans and the Democrats, but they were different than now. The Democrats were all Southern plantation owners, and the Republicans were progressives, that represented workers in the cities. And in order to get any legislation passed that would benefit the working classes, other than farm workers, the Southern Democrats, they used to call them Dixiecrats, would negotiate with the Eastern liberals, and the trading chip was always farm workers. And at that time, in the South, the main class were black workers, a lot of them farm workers and domestic workers. And the Dixiecrats controlled the powerful committees because the blacks were kept from voting due to Jim Crow laws. So, to benefit the working class, the industrial working class, farm workers were always the pawns. They would be traded off. And for the rest of the society, this was justified on the basis that all the farms were small farms. They couldn't afford to have unions, but that was really just a myth, because farm workers, the farms in California and many other places were very, very big at that time. And so because of this bad situation, farm workers were excluded from all the items mentioned there. But most importantly, they were excluded from the right to organize. So while industrial workers during the New Deal legislation got important rights, one of the most important ones that they got was the right to organize and bargain collectively, so that they would have the power to change things, but farm workers were left out. And this had a really drastic impact on workers, because industrial workers under the National Labor Relations Act were able to form unions, have a procedure for having union elections, and the employers were then forced to negotiate. But farm workers, were just left on their own. And this exclusion led to a real imbalance of power, because industrial workers had unions to protect them, and they could call strikes and kind of balance the bargaining between the employer and the bosses, but workers were left out. And so in the union, industrial workers, reached a high point of about, in the high 30s in terms of being organized and having power, to bargain, and were able to get a lot of improvements for the workers, like overtime pay, minimum wage or better wages and stuff like that. But workers didn't have any power, and they were just left out completely. And they were also, mainly minority, as I mentioned before, or lived in rural areas where the growers controlled everything. They controlled the police, they controlled the politicians, the judges, and whenever workers tried to organize, the efforts would be violently put down, squashed. I mentioned example is a Pixley cotton strike in California, where about 12,000 cotton workers decided, they thought they had the right to organize like the other workers, so they decided to call a strike. And the establishment, the sheriffs deputized all the growers, and they just violently put down the strike and killed about 5 workers. And that was, that's just an example of what was happening. And here in our own state, in Washington, we had a similar situation in Condon Orchards, just outside of Yakima, where the industrial workers of the world tried to organize the apple pickers, and the same thing happened. The employers, the growers, got their political friends to deputize all of the employers, and they went and smashed the strike and marched the leaders into Yakima, into a stockade, and set up a machine gun in the middle of Yakima in Zilla, and just violently crushed the strike. And that stockade was kept on for about 10 years, as an example of other employers employees not to organize. So this didn't start to change until 1965, and the reason I'm going through this is to show you the historical background of why the farm workers continue to be exploited even to this date. It started to change in 1965 when Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta started to organize migrant farm workers in California, and they had strikes, and they had all been quashed, as I mentioned, but they decided, not to meet fire with fire, but instead to take a nonviolent approach, when they were attacked. I remember we had a button called "Nonviolence is our strength," and that might be kind of contradictory, but it wasn't, because when you got attacked and you didn't attack back, it got a lot of publicity. They put a lot of pressure on the employers to stop doing that. And they had they had some strikes, but the one that started it all was the grape strike in 1965, when the Filipino workers at that time, the two dominant groups in agriculture in California, the biggest ag state in the country, the two groups were Mexican workers, Mexican American workers, and Filipino workers. The Filipino workers, under the leadership of Larry Italian, a great Filipino leader, decided to go on a strike because wages hadn't gone up in a long time, and they asked Cesar and Dolores to support them, and the union called a meeting, and the workers, even though they weren't ready yet to strike, decided they could not break the strike and went out on strike. And as predicted, all the forces of the power establishment were set against them, and the strike was broken. But this time what was different, though, was that it didn't end with a strike. They came up with a tactic of boycotts. How many people know what a boycott is? Okay, very good group. So what they said, if the growers thought that because they had broken the strike, that was the end of the strike, but that was actually just the beginning, because workers, it was a diverse group of workers, including farm workers and including ministers and other leaders, were sent to the cities where the grapes were sold, and launched a consumer boycott of the grapes. And nobody thought it would work, but it was very well organized. And in only 5 years, they had the warehouses in California were full of grapes that they couldn't sell, and the grape growers as a group were brought to the bargaining table, and the majority signed contracts. It's incredible, the support. And I was part of the boycott, but I was part of the second boycott. The leader, of course, were Dolores and Cesar, and we started when the strike and the contracts were signed, brought up incredible changes. People had representation. People could bargain with their employers. Wages went up. Pension plan was started. Medical plan was started, and the word spread like wildfire throughout the farm worker community. And at that time, I was a student at Yakima Valley Community College, and a good friend of mine, Tomas Villanueva, who was a great farm worker leader, decided we wanted to go to California to find out what this was all about. So we got into Tomas Pontiac and drove all night from Toppenish, Washington to Delano looking for Cesar Chavez. And we started in the rich parts of town because we expected him to be a white, pale-looking guy in a nicer part of town, but we couldn't find him until we finally went to the barrio, the poor section of town, and asked some workers that we saw, if they know where Cesar Chavez was. And they said, well, there he is, and pointed out at, a small Indian-looking guy, work clothes, and sure enough, that was Cesar Chavez. Kind of, broke our stereotypes, preconceived notions of what we thought a leader was like. And the thing that really impressed us was not so much his stature or what he said, but the fact that he had a lot of people believing in him. And the workers that we saw in California were very different than the workers of the valley, where people thought that nothing could be done. They had some agency, the feeling that they could change things was palpable. And so from then on, we got hooked to the farmworkers movement, and we went back to the Yakima Valley, and my friend Tomas Villanueva started organizing. He started the first farmworkers clinic in Washington State and probably on the West Coast in Toppenish. Seth was talking about how he was involved in that and as a Vista person, and I decided I wanted to go into law at that point, and because of the ACLU has started a project in the valley because conditions were so bad, and with their help, I got admitted to the University of Washington, becoming the first Latino to be so admitted, Latino farm worker. And one of the things that Cesar taught us was that it wasn't shameful to be a farm worker, because farm workers were really, we were the lowest of the low. But what was shameful was a society that permitted the working conditions and living conditions that farm workers were forced to live under. So, as I mentioned before, Tomas started the medical clinic, also a food co-op, and made contact with Cesar Chavez. We had met him in when we went to visit him, and he came to the valley. And here at the university, when I came, there was a lot of movement. The black students were leading up a movement to integrate the University of Washington, who at that point hardly had any minorities. There were like 5 Latinos and less than 50 black students in total. And so they sent a couple. A reverend and his wife, Daryl and John Van Pelt, and they came at by that time, thanks to the Black Students Union, the farm worker population, student population had grown to like 28. They talked to us and we became very involved in the boycott. And how many of you were involved in the boycott here? Yeah, so you know that. And that's great. I have an applause for that. Great supporter. So so we became very involved, and we basically learned how to organize, and and that's basically what happens when you have a movement. When you have a labor union trying to organize, and they get other people involved, and win or lose, you learn how to do stuff, how to change things, and you learn that you can make change. That's not all impossible. So Tomas then, just skip a little bit because it's a long story, but we started, Tomas, after working as a subsidiary of the UFW in California in the 70s, mid-70s, we started his own farm worker union in the valley, and they had a meeting in Sunnyside, Washington. And the main platform that they had was to end the discriminatory racist exclusion of farm workers from all of the state's labor laws. And our approach was not to just have a paid lobbyist, doing the lobbying for us. First of all, we had no money, but to use the farm workers themselves and teach them how to present their problem and go to Olympia as a group, in large numbers and start testifying about how unjust it was, the unjust situation they were forced to live under. And we didn't see, it was very hard to make change because farm workers had not been, or Latinos, Mexican Americans had not been in this state for centuries, like in New Mexico and California and Texas. We were recent arrivals, like in the late 1940s. So all the politicians were white. We had absolutely no representation at the political level. But we allied ourselves with the Democrats because they're the ones that were at least were saying that they were going to help the workers. And the growers, of course, allied themselves with the Republican Party. And people just went, and one of the first things that they concentrated on was on trying to change the workers' comp system that at that point excluded farm workers. So here you had workers working in one of the most dangerous industries in the state of Washington, yet they had no protections when they fell from trees or when they got poisoned by pesticides. It was just their tough luck. So people would go in crutches and in casts and stuff and testify. So the relationship with Cesar Chavez was very important, and Cesar Tomas established a very close racing relationship with Cesar, who came to the valley numerous times for two purposes. One was to gain support for the Grape Boycott that was still going on in the late 60s. But the other one was to educate workers and get them ready, to unionize, because Cesar's dream was to organize all farm workers. And here's a picture. This is Tomas Villanueva, saying a sign that says boycott grapes. And this is Cesar Chavez marching, I believe, in Toppenish, Washington in 1969. And what he did is that he wasn't, a dynamic speaker, but he could really connect with the community. And here's a picture of him talking to a group of farm workers in Granger, Washington, at a middle school, who had initially denied the request for Cesar to speak, but then after pressure from the community, allowed him to speak. And these are all people, I know half of the people that are here, including, let's see, a brother and 2 sisters, 3 sisters, and a whole bunch of other relatives. And it's interesting because it was not just farm workers, but there was like the local Catholic priest was there, and some, you can see some white people listening to what he was saying. So he was a great educator. And what really started, he was kind of laying the groundwork for the union to move into this state. And what really catalyzed the movement was when those contracts were signed in California with one of the biggest industries there, the grape industry. And workers, as I mentioned before, got benefits of a union contract that are listed. And so then in 1970, when workers saw the gains that farm workers had made in California, the people started going on a strike instead of just quitting, and that's what happened at Yakima Chief Ranch in Granger, Washington. People came to one of the people that were involved in the Grape Boycott, the Trevino brothers, and said they were going to quit because the employer wouldn't give them any wage increases, and they told the worker, well, don't quit, why don't you organize like Cesar Chavez did in California? So they asked for wages, and they were fired, and then they organized a strike at one of the ranches, and then they found out that the company had an even bigger ranch in Mapton, and so people were sent to picket the one in Mapton, and homemade picket signs went up, and the ACLU showed up with bullhorns and flags, and eventually the strike spread to. It was initially just with the biggest hop grower in the area, but then it spread to about 14 or 15 other companies, and they were just at the peak of harvest when hops have to be picked, otherwise they lose their potency. So we were able to get an agreement with Yakima Chief when other growers started signing contracts, and the demands were not very big. I mean, workers demanded an increase from $1.50 an hour to $2 an hour, and women workers, from $1.25 an hour to $2 an hour to have parity with the male workers. And at Yakima Chief, we made a special demand that they hold a union election to let the workers decide if they wanted a union. And because of the pressure, they finally agreed to a union election. And I'll show you a picture of it in a minute. But a lot of the very strong workers were women workers who had never been involved in these kind of demonstrations before. But here's a picture of a whole group of women, picketing the Yakima Chief office in Mapton, saying that they want, they want better working conditions. That calling other workers to walk out and strike, and eventually the election was held, and there was a committee of neutral observers that helped put it on. And this is a picture of one of the ballot boxes out in the fields, that says in Spanish, you deposit your ballots here. And this is a Unitarian minister from Sunnyside, and this here is one of the biggest growers, Erwin Newhouse from the Newhouse brothers, looking at the election, and when the ballots were counted, the union got 105 and no, only 3 of them. And, we were kind of naive at that time. We thought that if you won an election, then you would got a contract, but that wasn't what happened. Exactly the opposite happened. What we got instead of a contract was a fierce anti-union campaign led by the Farm Bureau and the politicians. And they went to Olympia and got all their buddies in the Republican Party to oppose the unionization and try to pass a bill that would limit strikes at harvest time and do away with boycotts, the only power that the union has. And then they again, they did what they had done before. The growers got together with organized labor and cut a deal that if labor got what they wanted, the farm workers would once again be sold out. But this time we were ready. The union sent their secret weapon, their chief lobbyist, Dolores Huerta, to Olympia, and she galvanized support from the Kennedys and others important Democratic officials, and then we got one of the senators, Marvin Durkin, the father of Jenny Durkin, who did a last-hour filibuster and killed the bill. That was the first time that growers had been stopped, and also the first time that it was exposed, what organized labor was doing. They were using us as sacrificial lambs. I think that one of the progressive magazines, I think it's either the New Yorker or the Nation, wrote an article about what was going on called "With Friends Like These," talking about organized labor. And but then that wasn't the end of it. The anti-unions fight continued. The employers formed a committee of 22, which were all growers, and try to pass that off as a legitimate union. And of course we opposed that. And so that went on for kind of a stalemate for a while. And then in 1986, the United Farm Workers of Washington State, led by Tomas Villanueva, was founded in Sunnyside. And one of their main platforms was to eliminate the discriminatory exclusion of farm workers from labor laws. They were going to dedicate themselves to do that, and then and to begin to form a coalition, not just of workers, but a more diverse coalition. Diversity is very important. Because you have people bring different strengths, and we began to work more closely with labor. And Tomas played a pivotal role in this because he befriended let me do the next one. He befriended Larry Kinney, Irish American. He was an orphan, and he came and he and Tomas had severe arguments, and he finally convinced him and got him to agree that farm workers would no longer be sold, to get rights for traded off to get rights for organized labor. And once we got that, and then he also appointed his chief lobbyist, an organizer to work with the farm workers to bring that about, a person by the name of Jeff Johnson. And then finally we got some power, things started to change. And the first breakthrough, one of the first breakthroughs came when the farm workers had been trying to get changes, to get farm workers included under the state minimum wages for a long time. And we always, at that time, Washington was kind of like a swing state. Sometimes the Democrats would be in control. The other times the Republicans would be in control. And that's where they had that trade-off farm workers. But once we got labor on our side, one of the first things that they came up with was to do an initiative. Let's see, what's it called? Anyway, there was an initiative that put the question of whether workers should be covered under state minimum wage, whether all minimum wages should go up, and whether farm workers should be covered. And it went up to the vote of the people, and it was passed by an overwhelming majority. About 80% of the voters voted in favor of that initiative, the first major victory for farm workers. And then after that, we started getting a whole bunch of changes. We got full coverage under workers' compensation, all the other items listed there, such as itemized pay statements. We didn't have that. Paid rest breaks, water toilets in the fields, hand washing facilities were included. So we started winning some of the battles, but it was still a long struggle because we still didn't have the right to, we had the right to organize. You couldn't be fired for organizing, but there was nothing to force the employer to bargain with the workers. So again, under the leadership of Tomas Villanueva, workers from Chateau Ste. Michelle, the biggest wine grower grape grower in the state, a group of workers came to the Legal Services office. At that time, I was the head of the Legal Services, the Farm Worker Division office in the Valley, and asking for help. And we said, "We'll help you, but you in turn have to organize the worker to support, to put pressure on Chateau Ste. Michelle." So we did what Cesar Chavez had done. We organized a boycott against Chateau Ste. Michelle and had the workers go to the winery, where, it's a very important music venue, and started putting pressure on the winery. And then also started a campaign. We found out that the Chateau Ste. Michelle was owned by American Tobacco, so we got an organized law student from Yale to go and organize a shareholder resolution I think they were based in the East Coast, and put pressure on them that way. And then what really started to happen, is that famous singers started boycotting Chateau Ste. Michelle, including Jackson Brown and Willie Nelson. and a lot of publicity. So finally the company gave in and decided and formed since we didn't have a National Labor Relations Act to administer the right to organize law, we formed a special committee that was led by Tom Foley, who had recently been defeated as Speaker of the House. So we set up our own Labor Relations Committee made up of growers and farm worker leaders, and I was appointed to the committee, and we held an election and took care of unfair labor practices that came up, and the workers voted for the first time, a fair and free election, and they again overwhelmingly voted for the union, and that finally resulted in the first farm worker contract in the history of the state of Washington in 1995. And then the workers, got rights that all the workers, elsewhere just take for granted, like better wages, pensions, medical plan, etc. And some of the, conditions were so good there that a lot of the original strikers, kept on working for a long time and now have retired under pensions from a union contract in agriculture, again, another first. And this is a picture of the Chateau Saint Michel workers taken after the votes were counted in front of, inside the property of the company. So that was, and the contract is still going on, by the way, from 1995 to now. The other farm workers also have, the going has, to be honest with you, the going has been still very slow, because there's really no procedure other than just brute force, to force them to the bargaining table. And but some other workers have gotten contracts, and mainly through corporate campaigns where different ways are figured out to put pressure on the company, kind of a variation of the boycott, and including a 3 Mile Canyon where about 300 workers, dairy workers, got covered under a union contract. Beef Northwest, and in 2017, another union that had been organizing in Western Washington called Familias Unidas por la Justicia, Families United for Justice, started a campaign against the biggest strawberry grower in the state of Washington, Sakuma, and there they launched a traditional boycott and got kind of progressive grocery chains to start taking off the grapes, including Costco. Costco played a very important part, and then the union finally had to, the company, Sakuma, had to agree to a union election, which the workers won, and they have another contract there. And there's been other scattering of strikes, and but as I said, the going is very slow. But one of the biggest beneficial things that have happened is that the organizing campaign organized not just the workers, but their advocates, their supporters, and as I said, it enabled key advocates to win labor contracts, because as I mentioned before, I was working with legal services, and what we would do is that we would help train the workers when they went to Olympia to testify and work on the strategy, and then take workers and with the help of labor identify the key people to lobby. And so we started getting a lot of important victories that aren't dependent on having to have a long drawn out fight with companies, and including the ones listed here. And one of the very important one actually was Garza v. Padnote, which happened when the hop strike started, because as I mentioned, the growers went to Olympia to try to outlaw strikes and boycott. But before that happened, workers at a hop farm in Grandview, Washington, try to organize, and they were met by employers, wielding shotguns, aimed at them and the organizers. And it was so egregious that one of the legal services attorneys that played a very important part in our campaigns, a person by the name of Mike Fox that was supposed to be here today but couldn't make it, so he asked me instead. But I hope you bring him. He's a great storyteller. So when workers try to negotiate with the employers to sign a contract, the employer said that if organizers showed up, there would be some dead beaners here. And so Mike, filed a lawsuit at a local court in Prosser, and he got that testimony in, and amazingly, a local judge, was appalled by what happened, and he enjoined the Patnode and Eli Reel from intimidating workers under a law in the state of Washington that you can't coerce workers to keep them from using their concerted bargaining powers, and that played a very important part, in preventing some of the violence that had taken place in California. Because when we started, we didn't know what was going to happen. We had no experience in organizing. We didn't know we were going to be shot or beaten up. I remember showing up at one of the local hop farms in Sunnyside, and it was right by the road, so I walked in trying to talk to the workers, and I was met by a grower's son with a bat in his hand. But luckily for me, a group of workers that knew who I was got in front of the grower and kept him from beating me up. But the victory that we got in Garza v. Patnode is very important. And recently, this same issue was taken to the Supreme Court in Bravo v. Dawson Companies, and the Supreme Court held that that workers had the right to engage in concerted activity for their mutual aid and protection, and so that's very established law. And then Sakuma Brothers, again, this is the big strawberry growers. A lawsuit was filed, and it was held that workers had to be paid for the time they were denied rest periods during peace work. And most importantly, in Martinez Cuevas de Ruder, it's a big dairy workers. Dairy work is one of the most gruesome and accident-filled work available, because you're dealing with huge animals, and a lot of people get injured, and they were being denied rest periods and paid lunch hours, and so the court, held that workers had the right to overtime pay. That they couldn't just be kept and worked overtime because their injury rates were very high. And one of the people that played a very important part in that is a justice who is now Chief Justice. I'm blanking out on his name, but he's Mexican American. So we won that. So now I'm being told that my time is up. So let me just go, and that's. I just want to say that fight for justice in the fields continues. Migrant workers are still isolated in rural areas. There's an incredible imbalance in power among the foremen and supervisors, and even the growers, especially, sexual assaults against farm worker women. There's been half a dozen or so cases, on this issue. And then another one that's occurring in my hometown of Sunnyside, Washington, Ostrom v. Mushroom Farms. It involved there's a company that came in and set up with the help of financing help from the local city, who were promised steady wages and higher wages if they help support the establishment of a mushroom farm in Sunnyside. So they got a lot of money from the city, And they hired a lot of women, and then the employer didn't like the fact that women were taking time off, to take their kids to the doctor or to go to high school, to school meetings, and started laying them all off. And the most incredibly, then they brought in H-2A workers, contract workers, and to replace the women that were laid off, kind of not knowing that Washington doesn't allow that under the Protection Against Discrimination Against Women. So the state attorney general got involved, Bob Ferguson, and filed a lawsuit against the company, and has so much evidence that the company was forced to settle for $3.4 million, representing the first time that an attorney general has done this and gotten this huge amount. But now the company was sold, and it's been taken over by a venture capitalist from Canada. It's going to be, again, another long struggle. So the imbalance in power still exists. But some of the hopeful things is that now a lot of the counties in eastern Washington, as opposed to the time that I was there, are minority, Latino, in other words, including Yakima, Benton County, Franklin, and a couple of others, and the court has just ordered a redrawing of the district. So I think that we're going to be able to start getting some political power. So there's a lot of work to be done yet, but also a lot of opportunity. And when I talk to students, I talk about that, how they got to get organized and become part of the group that establishes policy, because that's what determines the rights of workers. And that's how we initially organized farm workers in the state of Washington. So that's it. Thank you. Pardon? Oh, yeah. During COVID, farm workers were under the Trump administration were labeled essential workers and ordered back to work. So they had a huge disparity in infections, and they were put to work without any protection in many cases, and it was just very disproportionate impact on the workers. Just talking about how the imbalance in power doesn't just affect workers, but it affects the health and the well-being of the community in general. So we got a lot of work to do.
I noticed can I go ahead? I noticed a few slides back, there was the last thing on the slide said that Governor Locke vetoed tent law. And I wondered if you could explain what that was.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, I was in a hurry to get done. In the 1990s, farm workers had very few protections as far as housing is concerned. That's why I was able to live in terrible housing conditions, and then very minimal. But then the employers, it was a time when Washington was going between Republican and Democrat, managed to convince the legislators, and that's before we had our world presence in Olympia, to gut the existing very weak housing laws to permit growers to force their workers to bring tents and pitch them under cherry trees during the cherry harvest and call that adequate housing. And it passed actually the legislature, both the Republican and state. And then I had just come back to work on the Farmworkers Union at that for a period of time. So I got a hold of that, and then we launched a letter writing campaign aimed at Joe Deere and the governor to veto that law, because it had cleared both houses. And so we went to Olympia, set up, serenaded the governor. He had just had a new baby, and came out and told us to please be quiet, so we did. And then they had a meeting with us, and we invited him to come to Mattawa, which is one of the new places in the Columbia Basin where a lot of apple trees have been planted, thanks to water from the Columbia. And so we convinced him to go there, and he toured and there were a lot of people camping by the camping by the rivers also, because there was no housing. And so governor, I remember talking to the governor after he did the trip of the camp at the Columbia River, and he said that reminded him of his grandmother, I think, who lived in Hong Kong and had under very similar housing conditions, and assured us that he was going to do something. So he vetoed the bill, the very bad very low housing bill, and then through the leadership of Phyllis Kinney, legislator from a farm worker background, the first one actually from that background, she led a drive to get farm workers included under the Housing Trust Fund, and which started funding millions of dollars for farm worker housing. And so we turned that loss into a victory, because a lot of housing started getting built for farm workers. But so that was a great victory. But another thing that I forgot to mention through trying to get done is that now there's like close to 35,000 guest workers being brought in from Mexico, and they're getting paid a lot more than they would in Mexico. But at the same time, it's you use them and then you take them back, so they never get any political power. They never get rooted in the state like my parents did and all the other people that came, as free agents and not guest workers. And that puts a check on the growth of the political power of the farm worker community. So, so we have to keep a close eye on that. And I don't want to sound like I'm totally against guest workers, but there's a lot of danger in relying against guest workers. Our answer is that if you need workers, you should give them legal rights just like any other worker. I know it just went up, but I don't know how much. It's what is, anybody know, $16 or so an hour? It's close to that. I mean, it's a lot more than when we started, where it was nothing. So there's a lot of activity that's been going on. The problem is that all of this is in east of the mountain, and it gets very little coverage here. The Seattle Times is very very pro business, and it doesn't cover it very much.
We'll take two more.
Okay. Yeah.
Just a bit of historical background. When Cesar Chavez was doing his thing in California and just getting started, and a lot of farm workers were getting beat up out there, it happened that the United Church of Christ governing body was meeting in St. Louis during that time, and we sent a plane load of people from the executive body of the United Church of Christ to go out and march.
You also
With the farm workers. It was quite a dramatic event, right? And we had a good friend, a young man who lived in our backyard practically in St. Louis. He did the best filming of all of that. He was quite a photographer, and he did a lot of stuff like that. Anyway, it's an interesting history.
No, that's true. I want to thank the United Church of Christ. They played a very influential role. I mean, you funded the migrant ministry, right? Yes. Yeah, and that played a very, Jim Drake, Chris Hardenmeyer, some of the leaders that helped gather support, religious support, all came from funding from the National Farm Worker Ministry. Thank you. Okay.
Go ahead and let Zoa talk. Oh, okay. Was there one more question? Okay. Then we will say again, thank you for such a wonderful, educational, up-to-date.
Oh, thank you.
But most of all, thank you, Lupe, for
you.
all the work you've done for all the farm workers and everyone who needs a helping hand. We thank you. We're so grateful.
I'd do it all over again.
Thank you and good night. And again, on behalf of all of you, thank you for coming out. And it was a wonderful program. Thank you.